But when his drinking, lusting, and his hunger for power became known to more and more people, the demands to do something about this outrageous man became louder and louder.
Anyone who's seen my dick needs to die. I can't have them roaming around.
Hello. Today I want to talk about another character, but to mix things up a little here, I thought to pick a villain instead, and figured Xenos would be a good place to start, seeing as Xenos is a pretty divisive character. I gotta be honest, I've seen so many opinions on him. You have people that thought he was a great addition in 4.0 but was ruined by his return, people who thought he was bad in 4.0 but made better by his return, people that thought he would have better served as a side villain instead of the main villain, people who loved him all the way through or ones that hated him all the way through, and many different things. In any case, we do have to keep in mind he was overall received real well by the fans. Now, it's been 4 years since Stormblood released, and seeing as Xenos will be a big player in the Endwalker story, I figured this is a very good time to be looking back at his entire story and aspects of his character. Most people remember Xenos as being basically a one-dimensional character, a kind of a simple villain without any growth essentially, someone who is the ultimate rival to the Warrior of Light. That's it. That's his entire character, for good and for bad, and that is very much by design, which I will get straight into here, as I think it's good to talk about the fundamental design behind his character. So let's start from the top. Characters, right? They are important for any story, as without compelling characters, chances are your story would kinda suck. And an easy way to create said compelling characters and get the reader to care is through character arcs. A character arc is the internal transformation of a character as they struggle to overcome major flaws or wounds. From there, you can split these arcs into positive and negative arcs, otherwise called change arcs. These types of arcs are all about the character growing and learning, ultimately transforming as a person, whether that's for the better or for the worse. But there is an additional type of a character arc, and that's called the flat character arc. The flat arc focuses on a character who doesn't need to change personally and instead needs to improve and shape the world around them. Flat arcs are still character arcs, but instead of growing and changing as a character, flat arc characters stay the same. Instead, their journey is about learning to uphold their inner truth in a world that doesn't accept it, allowing them to overcome the external conflict along the way. In a flat arc, the character already knows their inner truth. Unfortunately, they live in a world or community that doesn't, and that is instead overtaken by an inner struggle that the character's truth stands in contrast to. This shifts the focus of their story from their own change to the change of others. Now, if we were to be specific, we can also split flat character arcs into positive and negative ones. Putting this into FF14, Xenos indeed has a negative flat character arc. Throughout his story, we don't really get to see him develop that much as a character, but we do see him affecting those around him by bringing out the worst in people. The Warrior of Light is the single most important character within his arc. See, the Warrior of Light also has a flat character arc, theirs being obviously a positive kind, which can be seen by them generally bringing out the best in people. This dynamic is important because it creates a situation where Xenos absolutely cannot corrupt the Warrior of Light, and the Warrior of Light absolutely cannot redeem Xenos. This is intended to be the main dynamic that is going on between the two in Stormblood, and was probably the reason they chose a flat character arc for the main villain of the expansion, so they could further explore this idea, more than what they necessarily could have done had Xenos been a simple side villain, as is often the case whenever you have the wants to fight stronger enemies rival character archetype. The way we see this play out throughout the story is that Xenos has this mindset of living for the hunt from the get-go, and most characters he interacts with have to play by his rules, or he will quickly and easily dispose of them, which serves to drive home the point that he isn't going to change anytime soon as a character, rather he's affecting those around him. An aspect used in almost every flat arc is shown here. Xenos is different from everyone else. No one shares his mindset, his truth, let's call it. Those around him either do not understand him or vehemently refuse to accept his truth, which is why he often gets called a monster, a beast, or the like. But as the story progresses, his resolve is tested and then proven correct when the Warrior of Light enters the picture. The Warrior of Light is a big turning point for Xenos' character because he finally found someone who he can connect to at a certain level, someone that would accept his own distorted view of the world. Of course, whether or not they reciprocate this feeling is really up to you, the player, but ultimately that is inconsequential. What matters is that is how Xenos chooses to see it. In this sense, we act as a constant trigger for his character developing as we keep interacting with him throughout the story. And you can very visibly see this through him slowly starting to feel alive again, as well as seeing him genuinely excited for developing his skills as a fighter so as to prepare for that final encounter, which of course you do as well. He doesn't go through a transformation, his character largely stays the same, and he doesn't try to redeem himself or feel remorse for past actions. But what happens is simply that he was able to find someone he could finally sympathize with, thus fulfilling that inner truth of his, which is the idea that, to quote the man himself, only man has the wisdom and the clarity to embrace violence for its own sake. Now, here's the thing. If you don't like flat character arcs, especially being applied to the main villain, then chances are you won't be liking Xenos. I think that's the simplest way I can put as to why this character is so divisive. But whether this was a good decision to make or not is not something I will be spending time discussing in this video. I will just accept the writer's decision and focus on talking about the execution. In other words, the things that they did correctly to really help sell this character to us, the audience. What made Xenos work as a villain? Xenos is the main villain of Stormblood and comes off as someone incredibly callous due to his brutality and absolute lack of empathy. He kinda shows up like your classic fantasy villain. Big guy in badass armor, appears very intimidating in every scene he is in. He's deadly competent and he's got the power to back it all up. Something that made his appearance at the start of Stormblood memorable to many people was the fact that him being powerful wasn't told to us, it was shown to us. Scripted to be unwinnable fights have been quite common throughout the franchise, but it is worth mentioning that this was the first time they pulled this off in FF14 specifically, and so it was pretty impactful. It was intended to make you feel that the Warrior of Light too can be bested in combat, that you aren't invulnerable, and in the context it was done made it devastating, seeing you, the hero, unable to save any of these people and essentially bleeding on the floor. In a lot of Japanese stories, and you can definitely see this throughout the Final Fantasy series, there is a common notion that as long as someone trains really hard, they can become formidable foes in combat and perform incredible feats. This is most definitely the case with Xenos. He isn't some chosen one, he has no special powers to speak of, nor any easy tickets. He was simply someone who trained his entire life to become an extremely skilled fighter, and a big part of it was more than simply dedication to training. Xenos was actually quite smart and crafty in figuring out ways to overpower his opponent, but that's something we'll get into later. My point is that this is another aspect of Xenos that is meant to be simplistic and very much by design. This is brought home really well in one of his quotes in the Royal Menagerie: "We tower above the gods, you by your gift, I by my might," showing that Xenos got to where he is at not by free handouts but by simply the merit of being incredibly dedicated towards becoming more and more powerful. One would assume that he was privileged due to his upbringing, but that isn't really the case, which again I will talk about more later when we get into his backstory. Anyway, my point here is that an aspect that was absolutely necessary for this kind of villain to work was executed really well here, because they managed to make Xenos seem intimidating right from the get-go. Another major contribution was the dynamic between him and the Warrior Flight, which was executed really well. I already touched down on this earlier, so I won't talk about it too much, but something that many have noted that should be mentioned is that if we were to extrapolate this parallel between Xenos and the Warrior Flight further, in a meta kind of way, consider how we as the player always look forward to epic encounters with each patch. So too would Xenos' only motivation be to find something to fight that would make him feel alive in an otherwise shallow world. I could definitely see this angle being intended by the writers as they were creating Xenos. Now again, it doesn't really matter whether you yourself see the Warrior Flight in this way. What matters more is that it's very easy for Xenos to get that picture, given all your deeds. Next is how Xenos fits into Stormblood thematically. There exists a rule in writing that is as old as time, that to make a great villain they should be the antithesis of the journey that the heroes go through, or to be more precise, being the antithesis of the core themes that the story is trying to set up. Emet-Selch follows this premise to the letter, to use an example, but with Stormblood they did something a bit different. Let's start off by establishing Stormblood's theme. As with many complex stories, it has of course multiple themes going on, but the core theme that we see heavily emphasized throughout the story is of course the desire of attaining freedom at all costs, even if that may result in the ultimate sacrifice, as well as potentially harming those close to you. The idea that it's better to die in hope and freedom than to live in despair and oppression. Or, to TLDR it, liberty or death, as the game likes to put it. So, the villain should then be something that opposes this ideology, right? Well, that's what I mean, that with Stormblood the writers kinda veered off slightly from that rule. What I mean is that according to this textbook example of how to write a villain, the one to fit the bill wouldn't be the actual main villain, Xenos, but rather Yotsuyu, a side villain that dies 70% through the story. She is the perfect kind of figure that would go against the main message that Stormblood is trying to convey. She's brutal, tyrannical, and chooses to oppress people because she felt betrayed. The interesting thing as well, of course, is that Yotsuyu does end up being the final boss of the overall Stormblood arc that ends in 4.3, but as far as 4.0 is concerned, Xenos is the main villain, not her, which makes for this fun little curveball. This is how Xenos ties into the core theme of Stormblood. Ever since childhood, he was robbed of any choice in life, even such basic things to a child, such as playfulness or innocence, was never an option. He was groomed for a singular purpose, to be that ideal crown prince which Varys wanted him to be. And though that is something I extrapolate based on the short story, even in the game proper you get to see this on full display. He really does not like his occupation as the Viceroy of Ala Mhigo and Doma. The point that is being demonstrated here is that Xenos, while he does have a purpose in life in the form of his duty, it's all completely superfluous to him because he does not have any kind of drive to perform said duty, leading him to being this empty man inside with no purpose in his life to speak of. While he does have a lot of leverage over his subordinates, he is ultimately just a puppet, unable to dictate any kind of direction for his own life. I think a lot of people miss the point regarding his obsession with the Warrior of Light and wanting to seek a better fight. The whole wanting to have an epic fight with someone and living for the thrill of the hunt is honestly just a mask. What that is all really about is the fact that he was never able to find a reason for existing. He was just an emotionless, empty husk of a man with nothing to get excited about after getting up from bed. Someone just doing his job as he was told, unable to solve things in the way that he wanted, which no doubt kept gnawing at him more and more over the course of his life. The point that should be focused on is that the Warrior of Light gives Zenos a purpose in his life, one that he can for the first time ever actually cherish. So it's not the fighting itself that makes him happy, as is the case with someone like Luon the Beast King, who genuinely just gets excited from the adrenaline rush of fighting someone strong. With Zenos, it's more about the fact that it gives him a purpose and it makes him free, since it's what he wants, not what some asshole of a father preordained. I know it's a very minute distinction because it is still the fact that he's fighting the Warrior of Light that achieves that goal. I'm just bringing it up because I feel like many people kinda gloss over this whole point and just say, yeah, he's your basic throwaway villain who just wants to fight bigger dudes, since clearly the writers left an abundance of hints in the game to show that there is more to it than that. And so, you see, in a story where a central theme is about gaining freedom at all costs, even the main villain is a victim. You, as the Warrior of Light, finally free Zenos from this cycle that he has been going through his entire life. You show him, indirectly, that there is another way, one that he can choose for himself. In other words, you show him the light. This is ironic because that's kinda your job as the Warrior of Light, even if the person you save happens to be an extremely evil person. Also, some food for thought. Once he finally felt alive with his final confrontation with the Warrior of Light, he turned into Shinryu and was flying free over Alamigo. Perhaps that too was meant to be symbolic. This completes Zenos' character arc, which follows pretty much your standard flat character arc. In Act 1, we start off by seeing him being alienated from everyone around him. In Act 2, we see his resolve being tested and then proven correct, with the Warrior of Light being added to the equation, and then finally in Act 3, he makes his final choice based on his truth, which is doubling down on the Warrior of Light and accepting him as his first/only friend, and then ultimately killing himself so that he could continue to be free instead of going back to being shackled in one way or another. Right, so let's delve a bit deeper into Zenos' childhood. As you all know, I do very much enjoy whenever we get to have a proper glimpse at a character's upbringing, since it allows us to elaborate a little better on what it was that caused them to behave the way we see them portrayed in the game. With Zenos, I should preface this by saying that there are very few hints about his upbringing and the relationship with his father when it comes to the game proper. Most of this stuff comes from the short story that was told in a book that compiled all the short stories that anyone could go and read from their website: Tales from the Calamity, Tales from the Dragonsong War, and Tales from the Storm. However, it also added 4 extra chapters that were exclusive to this book, one of those being The Hunt Begins, which offers a glimpse into Zenos' past. Now, this isn't something I have really talked about before, so let me go off topic for a moment here. There is a lot of extra material besides the MSQ that you can utilize to get a better understanding of a certain character, in-game events, and that sort of stuff. Some of this is in-game, such as through the Chronicles of a New Era quests, side quests, flavor text found in various places and things of that nature. However, some of it is also outside the game. The 2 main places to look for are the Encyclopedia Eorzea books, otherwise known as lore books, both volumes, as well as the short stories from each expansion, which I mentioned earlier, and there are also the Tales from the Shadows short stories that cover events related to Shadowbringers. In addition to this, there are interviews and other random releases like the book I was just talking about. This means that to get a full picture of the events that happen in-game, you do have to read on things that isn't just the MSQ. Now, if you expect me about to follow this up into a rant, I am not. I actually have no issue with this. As a writer, it's very important that you do not bloat the audience with pointless exposition which only serves to get them confused due to an onslaught of information and in most cases leads to them getting disinterested. Flavor is nice, but it has to be done in moderation. Little snippets here and there, but don't explain every single detail. Having this information spread out is a good way to still convey that information but without slowing the story to a halt. Here's the thing, every source I mentioned here, both in-game and outside, are not necessary to understand the plot and character motivations. They are just extra flavor that nerds can go out of their way to look up if they want to learn more. By just doing MSQ, you pretty much understand 95% of all things going on. This extra stuff just fills in that final 5%, hence what I meant at the beginning with a full picture. I have heard some people claim that they don't like the fact that they have to go out of their way to read these short stories that are not in the game. The thing is, these short stories would never be in the game anyway, because they were hard to fit into any piece of content, whether that be MSQ or a side quest. So no, you don't have to go out of your way because you already get provided with plenty information through the MSQ, and the short stories are freebies because they wouldn't exist in the game anyway. Okay, so what was the point with this derail segment? I found it nice to be able to explain my own view on the topic, as well as hopefully you guys being able to better appreciate the amount of work that goes into producing these lore videos, but there is also a reason I brought it up here specifically. That is because I actually do have one exception where I think they went too far with it, which is this short story about Xenos, because reading through and understanding the context that this story is telling is crucial in understanding Xenos' past that brought him here, by exploring his relationship to his father. Alright, so to finally get to the point, Xenos' childhood has multiple things going on that all lead into the broken man that we see in-game. The first thing has to do with the dream that he keeps seeing. In 5.2, we learn that Xenos has a recurring dream, one that is eerily similar to the final days. This is of course a very interesting setup that they will no doubt expand upon in Endwalker, but an important thing to consider is the impact that something like this would have on someone's psyche. Keep in mind that he kept seeing this dream over and over ever since he was a small child. Do you have any idea what that would do to a kid? Seeing literally a hellish world-ending apocalypse with people being slaughtered on the street on repeat? This goes a long way into explaining why Xenos is so depressed and bereft of emotion, however it is not the only factor in play here. While this attribute, let's call it, was bound to leave pretty much any child mentally scarred, I think there is another thing that served as a kind of a catalyst to make it that much worse. That is Xenos' father, Varys. He was, by far, the single biggest reason for why Xenos turned out the way he did. He showed pretty much no interest in raising him like a proper parent, zero. He was very distanced and callous towards Xenos at all times, showing no love and instead viewing his son as a simple political chip that he would one day find use for. This included not allowing Xenos to express any kind of freedom of choice by making every decision for him, rarely ever meeting him, showing zero interest in his mental health, a lack of care for his hobbies. I could keep going, but in short, he definitely earns his place in the asshole Final Fantasy Dad Club. And the biggest mistake is taking this incredibly depressed and mentally damaged person and then completely willingly putting him into a position of a lot of power and into a position you know that they have zero interest in, which is just a recipe for disaster. For Xenos, the people around him did not matter. The short story even mentions him trying to find studying partners and such, however he simply never showed any interest. The only thing that could have saved him was to have a loving parent figure that would have actually taken care of him. What he got instead was a father that chose to neglect him at every possible turn, with a cunt of a dad like Varys on top of those dreams scarring him for life. There was pretty much no other way this was going to end for him. In most cases where you have characters with troubled childhood, there tends to be at least one person who was there, looking out for them and showing compassion that kept them from ending up badly. Cryon had Galuf, Reen had Tancred, and so on. Xenos had no one. You know what Xenos had? The person training him wanting to murder him. And don't get me wrong, I am not excusing Xenos, he is very much an evil person, but it's always important to look at how the person ended where they are at, and in this case, it pretty much all comes down to Varys being just a bastard all around, which is why I view him as the bigger evil of the two. Next, let's talk about Xenos' personality. I can imagine you thinking, wait, he has a personality? And you are kinda right, there isn't much to him, because that was the point, he's empty inside. But there are a few things I want to touch on. Following up on what I just discussed, an interesting aspect with Xenos is his apparent disdain towards Garlemald. This makes a lot of sense, since his father, whom as we just established was not a very good parent, is pretty much the embodiment of Garlemald and its doctrine, being the Emperor and all that. An interesting thing to observe is how both of the two people that he keeps interacting with throughout the story, Fordola and Yotziu, are not Garleans, and both share the mindset of hating their own kind. I feel like this was very much intentional, given how he gives both of these characters a second chance, yet he instantly deletes any Garleans that fail him on the spot. A big factor is of course the merit that these characters bring to Xenos, but I think the intention was to also help us, the audience, to notice that kind of a bias he has against his own nation and his own kind. And we do see this throughout the story, that he has a general disinterest to fill any of Garlemald's needs, even to the point that he goes out of his way to control an icon instead of killing it on the spot as the Garlean doctrine dictates. You could say this is a result of his general lack of caring towards most things in life, but I personally think that it's a mask kind of a thing. He puts on that type of an appearance, but it's very likely that after his upbringing, he would absolutely loathe anything related to Garlemald due to reminding him of his father and being shackled to this position he is in. Besides the subtleties, a big clue I can think of is the scene where he reveals Shinryu to us, where he seems genuinely excited to trash Garlemald because of course he would. At this point, he has chosen to fully let go of the shackles put on him by his father and just do whatever he wants. Of course he is gonna share his opinion on his homeland that offered nothing to him his entire life. Another thing that people often think of when they're thinking about Xenos is that he's simply a brute or a murder hobo. The funny thing is that Xenos is actually quite smart. Again, the short story touches on this, but we see that in-game as well. A big example I can give is him being able to figure out the true potential behind using a fake echo by reading Baelsar's reports. He does pack an immense amount of power, but he's not stupid. On the point of him being a murder hobo, he's actually quite calculative about when he chooses to kill people and when not to. A good example is when he heard that Greenwood had deserted. The only way in which he punished him was by reassigning him because the will to live is not without merit. But the officer who deferred critical missions to their subordinates without ever taking to the field was someone he saw as basically cowardly and useless to his chain of command, so he summarily executed him. And this of course is just one example. There's many cases throughout Stormblood where he chooses not to kill people because it would not achieve anything. Now, I'm not saying that this really justifies any of his actions, the guy is ruthless and evil as all hell, but calling him a murder hobo is a bit disingenuous. final point I want to bring up before the next segment. This is a bit less to do with personality, but just to go back on something I mentioned at the start. A big part of what is supposed to make Xenos entertaining is not him being an incredibly compelling and developed character, but more that he is powerful, he has heavy presence every time he's on screen, he is extremely competent, and overall he's just badass as a villain. Like I said, he reminds me a lot of classic fantasy villains. Of course, this appearance starts to crack towards the end of the expansion when he becomes obsessed with the warrior flight, which is of course very much done on purpose. My point is that you don't look forward to seeing Xenos because of a tragic backstory that makes you think of their plight. You look forward to seeing what badass feat he will accomplish in the next scene. Which brings me nicely to the next topic. Yeah, so about bringing him back, as I said at the start, this definitely had a mixed reception. But then I did promise I won't be discussing whether it was the right call to make or not, so I will just talk about how it was handled. One line I really love is when he's still a random LSN resistant soldier. He has this moment where he, just for a split second, entertains the idea of turning over a new leaf and redeeming himself, and then immediately dismisses it. Not only does it show that he really has got that resolve to stay on this path that he chose towards the end of 4.0, but it's also almost funny in how fourth wall breaky this line feels. He's basically telling the audience, nah, I ain't gonna be redeemed. It's pretty awesome. I think the value that Xenos being brought back added was to serve as this intriguing wildcard type of a character. Throughout those patches, we legit had no clue what crazy shenanigans the man was gonna pull off next, and he did keep delivering. Like, the amount of things he does is bordering on ridiculousness, which I think was very much the idea with this. It's also very smooth how he was being set up throughout those 3 to 4 years, as it definitely gets you excited to see what will happen with us and him in Endwalker. There are also 2 major events that happen with Xenos' character, and no, I'm not talking about the damn scythe. First is the reveal about him seeing those dreams in 5.2 that I talked about in regards to his messed up childhood, but the other thing is the source plotline that happens throughout 5.0 with Varys, Elidibus, Gaius, Estinian, and Xenos. Not only do we see how much of an absolute unit he is, he single-handedly forces Elidibus off his own body, he wipes his ass with the combined onslaught of Gaius and Estinian. Oh, and he casually just kind of prevents the 8th Umbral calamity from happening by killing Varys and stopping the use of Black Rose. But more than that, I found it really satisfying seeing him whack his old man. Even though he claims it was for the hunt, once again I feel like that's just the mask he is putting up. Yeah, I imagine a big motivation was to ensure that the warrior flight survives, but there is no way that he doesn't feel satisfaction, at least on some level, for finally getting to kill the man who attributed the most to his life feeling tormented. Not to mention that this would be the act that finally sets him free. Without his father and the Empire to bind him, he now basically has a blank check, the whole Empire to do with as he pleases. And wow, is it satisfying to see Varys' face when he realizes his Empire, the thing that he prioritized over actually giving a shit about his own son, is now gonna be absolutely ruined by the very thing he chose to ignore. Oh man, talk about things backfiring on you big time. It's also very funny how even in those final moments, he still refuses to acknowledge anything his son has done, nor trying to understand him on any level, simply just firing insults at him. Even better when you consider that those insults don't really even apply to Xenos, which shows how little he even knows about his own son. Let's also not forget how Varys sees Xenos similar to how Torden saw us in 3.0. Easily one of the best death scenes in the game. And we're not done. It's also here where Xenos finds out the truth about Zodiark and Hydaelyn. You see, the reveal about them being primals, the way he acknowledged it, and the way we acknowledged it differed wildly. Now, up until this point, Xenos has been, without a doubt, one crazy individual, but I definitely think this is the scene where he gets pushed over the edge and really becomes full-on deranged, Like, there's absolutely no going back now. Let's put this into perspective. He just got to kill the person he hated the most in his entire life, and on top of it, he just found out that even the very will of the star is nothing but a being summoned by the people, a being that is below them, below him. This serves to only reaffirm Xenos just how meaningless life really is. Hydaelyn and Zodiark are supposed to be the highest forms of creation, powerful and above everyone else, literally the wills that spawned all creation. Yet he's over here using artificially made blessings and forcing the most powerful servants of Zodiark out of their bodies. How is it that a mere man can pull off these feats if these supposed gods that are the most revered among them are so powerful? Because they aren't. They are weak beings that are just as pathetic as any of these other trash primals. And so, he's going to go after Zodiark. Not just because it makes for a good warm-up before encountering the warrior flight again, but to also prove how meaningless everything else in life is when even the highest beings in existence are so pitiful that he can simply go and hunt them down. And that's basically where his character gets left off. I mean, the rest of the cutscenes with him throughout the lead up to Endwalker involve him finding a weapon, helping Fandaniel set up his crazy scheme, getting mad that he damaged the warrior flight, and basically just getting more and more obsessed over the prospect of encountering his only friend once again. Originally, I wanted to leave a bunch of theories during this segment, but I decided to instead end the video here for two reasons. One, there are so many theories surrounding Xenos, it's almost crazy how many there are. Due to the volume, I simply cannot cover them all. There's also videos on this by other YouTubers. And two, I feel like there isn't too much we can speculate as to what is going to happen without taking some real shots in the dark. So I will instead just leave you with all the potential hints left by the writers, and maybe you, the handsome viewer, can leave your own theory down in the comments if you like. All in all, Xenos was, in my opinion, a very well designed character. You may disagree with the fundamental choice behind his character, but what the writers did with the character was excellently written. His arc was executed quite nicely, his backstory is solid, his character ties into the core values that the story tried to portray, and he's most definitely an entertaining villain to have on your screen anytime he appears. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this one, and I appreciate taking the time to listen to my thoughts. Have a nice day.
The beast shall kindle the flames of the apocalypse. Into its domain shall the hero set forth for the final chapter in the tale of this star.